April, ministry, a PhD in psychology. You've been a practicing psychologist for many years, and you have, in your last part of your career, started to focus on psychology and leadership. And so, hence, your new model and what you've been building. And so you're going to share some more about that today. But I'd love to know what sparked your interest in a focus on leadership in your psychology practice. And then we're going to get to specifically you telling us about leadership injuries.
Well, I think this area of interest came about for me over time in terms of my own personal development, going to a program to focus on leadership development, and then conversations actually with my father, who is also a speaker in the leadership space. He talks about the exponential mindset. And it was so interesting. There was a season where, we were doing elder care, and so, for his parents. And so we spent a lot more time together. And it was during that era that the ideas that I had gleaned from working with veterans for all those years, something began to incubate about how to bring that same model of healing into the space for leadership injuries, because so many people have been hurt by leaders. And I think even in talking with my dad, there's such an exponential effect, right? If you can affect a leader, you
Yeah,
can affect their entire sphere of influence. So you change a leader and you change the world.
yeah, yes, yes, yes. Love it. So tell us, leadership injuries isn't a term that we've necessarily heard. It's new-ish. I don't know if you coined it or, but tell us about leadership injuries. What are they and how can we identify them?
Sure, sure. And I will share. So yes, I coined the term, and I'll share a little bit about the kind of the history of that. But if I could do a screen share, I'll jump in just real quick here. We'll do
There you go. Good.
this. How are we there?
Perfect.
I I like to start this way because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
This is leadership injury, right? If you have ever experienced anything like this, then you may have suffered a leadership injury. Now, obviously, it's not always as egregious as this, and sometimes it's actually very subtle. But I want to give you hope, even if you've had something that felt like this, right? Where you had somebody who was at your throat, somebody who was supposed to be lifting you up, but went about it in the wrong way. And by
Yeah.
the way, I think it's incredibly important to say that in the context of the Christian Alliance for Inclusive Development, when people are also representing God or espousing to do so, and then their leadership is not demonstrative of the heart of the Father, that can
Yeah.
be doubly painful. So I just want to acknowledge that right out of the gate. But the
Yeah.
other reason I like to use this particular thing is I want us to think about these leadership injuries and this entire conversation within the frame of story,
Mm,
right? And
mm,
you get to tell a story. Maybe something like this has happened to you. Maybe you had the worst boss, but even if you had a bad boss, that can become a catapult and a catalyst for you to become the best boss that you can be, right? And so I want us from go to be thinking in terms of these redemptive kinds of stories that we can have.
mm.
And really, if we think about story, I love this idea from Donald Miller. He says every story has a hero, a victim, a villain, and a guide. And when it comes to leadership injury, we have the opportunity throughout our career, we can play any one of those roles and maybe all of them,
Mm.
right? So we're going to kind of look at it from different angles. If we're talking about leadership injury, right? I think a lot of people kind of go like, "Oh, okay, I've been a victim of this. This is something that I've suffered." And so I want to address it from that angle first.
Yeah.
And if you have, you're in good company, right? When we think about story, every hero has a backstory, right? And it doesn't matter if you're DC or Marvel, if you're, Spider-Man or Batman or what, like there is something in their history that helped them become who they are and actually becomes that engine that fuels their why and sometimes even their how of how they're helping others. And so as we enter into talking about this, even if you've been a victim, that doesn't mean you have to stay there. You can go from that to being a victor to becoming a hero. And when we talk about leadership injury, I think of it this way, actually thinking about Superman. Every
Yeah.
Superman has their kryptonite, right? There's something from the past that when it shows up in the present day, it affects your performance.
Yeah.
Superman is incredibly strong, right?
Yeah.
Until that
Yeah.
kryptonite shows up. And so you may be incredibly strong until that thing that happened, whatever it was, but it somehow got lodged in your soul.
Yeah.
And then whenever that situation comes up, it's like, oh, I'm not at full strength. I'm not able to show up fully as who I am because I'm feeling the impact of something from the past. And so if we were to give a simple definition to leadership injury, I would say it's a negative interaction with leadership or authority and the lasting effects of those. I make the distinction between leadership injury, right? Anybody can kind of get their toes stepped on, and what I would call critical leadership injury, or CLI for short. And that idea, the critical part there, it's not necessarily that the leader was critical of you, although that may have been the case. It's really
Yeah.
when we talk about somebody being critically injured, right? It's more serious.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so a leadership injury, your boss said he didn't like your shoes. That's probably something you're going to be able to
Yeah.
brush it off. Taylor
Yeah.
Swift, like shake it off. It's going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Then there are those other things that kind of get lodged in our souls, and they
Yeah.
have this effect, and nobody can see it. Sometimes we can't see it.
Yeah.
And so there are these invisible injuries. And that's actually kind of how the concept developed, kind of going back a little bit more into your earlier question, right? I had spent the early part of my career working with combat veterans. And so talking every day with people who have had invisible injuries from the battlefield. And that
Mm-hmm.
might come across as post-traumatic stress. That might
Mm-hmm.
be moral injury, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that injury word kind of came like, oh, okay, there's the invisible injury, moral injury is a type, and leadership injury is a type.
Mm-hmm.
And moral injury is something that's experienced by a lot of people, not just, combat veterans. We have frontline healthcare workers,
Mm-hmm.
right? COVID saying, okay, my policy says I need to do X, but I've got a family in front of me asking me to do Y. What am I going to do? There may be people on this call who have experienced that tension, right? In an NGO space of like, well, our policies and procedures say we need to do this. But then the people in front of me, this is what they really need. And so we encounter these different situations that cause invisible injuries. Leadership injury is another type,
Yeah.
different from moral injury, but an invisible injury that, man, that thing that had an effect on me way back there is continuing to hold me back. And maybe without me even knowing that it was.
And
Just to give some examples, I think that's helpful just to kind of like, what are we talking about? I can think of one situation where I was working with an executive, and he had been a VP in a pretty high powered company, and he got blasted in the boardroom one day. The CEO just kind of ripped him a new one, and it was in front of everybody, right? And it destroyed his confidence.
yeah. Yeah.
And so he took it really personally, and then that kind of put a ceiling on him. And eventually he ended up leaving that company, right? And it wasn't necessarily that he had made such a bad mistake that everybody else was like, oh my goodness, you're done and you're finished and we're never going to promote you or give you any more responsibility. It had to do with his internal reaction to
Mm-hmm.
being dressed down in that way. And so it kind of limited him and his ability to feel worthy of his position, his confidence that he had a sense of agency to affect change. And right. And when we get hurt like that, it's natural to go into self-protection mode of like, oh, I'm never going to let that happen again. Right. But it doesn't have to be something that's that egregious, right? That one's pretty obvious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had another conversation with somebody who it was their third grade teacher. And the teacher had asked for feedback from the students. The student gave the feedback that the teacher had asked for, and the teacher took it sideways and then snapped at the student. And so this student says to themselves at 9 years old, I'm not going to speak up in front of authority ever again. Like, never going to do that again. Right. And then fast forward, you make this decision at 9 years old. And then in your
Yeah.
20s, now you're at work
Yeah.
and you're in front of authority, but you've made this decision. I'm not going to speak up in front of authority because I don't want to get my head bit off. And
Yeah.
so that's then what it translated to. And I
One of
think,
one of the things I just wanted to
oh,
raise
sure.
the issue of the because I'm still back on the Darth Vader picture, or one of the things I have found, and if you examine the challenging leaders in your life, you can draw a line from, we have typologies for how bad leadership shows up, from anything from the micromanager, the microaggressions, the egregious behaviors. When you examine the person, so looking at the villain's backstory, if you will,
Mhm.
you can draw a direct connection to something that's broken in their understanding of their own imago Dei, of their own identity in how God sees them. And so I found when I was working with a really difficult leader in my 20s, somebody pointed that out to me about their backstory of childhood abuse, father abandonment, always told their whole life they were never good enough. And yet this person was an overachiever. And it gave me such empathy. And it was the empathy that I needed to be able to start my own healing and to be able to relate to that person in a very different way, praying for them rather than griping about them, et cetera. So I don't want to fly by that point of remembering that the challenging leader in our lives is also God's beloved.
Right.
It's also one created in his image. And so at the very least, praying for them and trying to understand, why are they the type of leader that they are? Because we do tend to become the leaders by which we were led, good, bad, or the ugly, unless we take a point in our time, whether it's through studies or intentionality or conversations like this, to stop and reflect on, am I just perpetuating the same kind of leadership model I had seen and experienced my whole life? So, yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that to light.
yeah,
Yes, the same thing happens with the so-called villains, right? Whether it's,
yeah,
the Joker or whoever, you think about that, but the bosses, it's hurt people. And
yeah,
I want to pause here because even though we're kind of talking mostly about workplace injuries, leadership injuries, I think it's worth noting, like, our first leaders are our parents. And how many, people have had something that flew out of their mouths as a parent, that was something that was said to them, and maybe even something that they said, I would never say that, and then here it comes, right? So our parents, and then we
we
have
become the
teachers,
parents by which we were raised.
right? Then we have teachers, then we have coaches, we have pastors, and
Yeah,
we have bosses, right? And so, I mean, there may have been a series of different leaders that you were shaped by. I think it's also worth noting, so you can have a bad leader, you
yeah,
can also have a really good leader who had a bad moment.
yeah, yeah,
And so, to not paint with this broad brush and to say, like, hey, all of us are fallible, we're human, there may have been a stressor, things like that need to be entered into the conversation. And I think then, as we start to look at things, we'll identify different kinds of
yeah,
leadership injuries. And I'd love to give people just a few little bullet points to kind of like hang some hooks on in terms
yeah,
of what to be looking for, because you're going to see different patterns in terms of how the injuries occur and then how people respond
yeah,
in terms of how they occur. So first of all, these can be acute things, kind of like we said, like, okay, somebody got dressed down, like there was a moment
yeah,
in time or a comment that was made. It can also be the chronic, right? The
yeah,
accumulation of things. And then you can have a hybrid. I've seen things where it's like a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, it builds to something that erupts, or that weird thing that happens like when there's a big moment here and then it's just like, oh, it just got weird after that, right? And so
yeah,
nothing
yeah.
quite got back to like it was supposed to. And so then there were a lot of
Actually,
little things that followed. It can happen either way.
well, and the egregious acts seem to garner everybody's sympathy in the workplace. Oh, you
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have been dressed down like that, et cetera. I find it is the subtle, daily,
Mm-hmm.
overlooked for projects, undermining comments that no one else hears. It's the daily, I find that the most um, distressing and the most damaging, because it's not in the public eye for everybody else to see. It's,
Right.
this leader doesn't like your personality, and so they make that known in some form or fashion. They don't trust you, therefore they're never going to invest in your development, and they subtly undermine your self confidence and your own identity. So
Right. And you're
yeah,
not receiving that validation. In fact, there may be kind of almost like a gaslighting
yeah,
of, oh, it's your problem. It's something
yeah,
wrong with you. as
yeah,
opposed to, oh, wow, this is actually somebody who has something that's kind of off in their soul. There's an unhealthy pattern with that leader, but it's not being acknowledged. And I think that's one of the things that makes it more difficult.
yeah.
And we
Well,
begin to
that's why
question ourselves.
we've been stressing every supervisor in an organization should be trained as coach, not full on, full scale coaching capabilities, but so that they rethink their mindset of the role that a supervisor should play. It's easy to coach a team of stars, but what do you do with the person who struggles, you know?
Mhm.
And how do you coach them? How do you have the hard conversations? Teaching supervisors how to be better leaders. But I'm looking at the time, so I want to make sure. Let's talk about if someone in this group has identified some leadership injury. How do they recover from that? And so I want to hear your process because I really
Yeah.
liked what you had shared with me before about the process. So let's
Okay.
look at
Yeah. So let me do a screen share again. I'll pull this up for you and we'll
great.
kind of walk through the process together. And this is part of that hero's journey, right? It takes some
Mhm.
courage to face this,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
but boy, howdy, what's on the other side of it? Like it's so
yeah,
worth it, right? To know that we can come into a place of healing. And the
yeah,
first thing, actually, we're talking about validation. It really just recognizing the impact even for yourself before you get anyone else involved, just realizing, oh wow, this was a thing that happened. It hurt me, it impacted me. Not
yeah,
judging myself because
yeah,
I was hurt or impacted by that, even if it seemed to be small. And I think
yeah,
that's one of the things that happens is sometimes there's a tendency to minimize, right? That it's oh, it wasn't that big a deal. Well, if that was the case, then it won't take that much to address it, right?
yeah,
So, okay,
yeah,
if it was minor, then let's just go ahead and take care of that. And recognizing this could have impacted your view of yourself. It
yeah,
could have impacted your view of leadership or authority. By the way, it's not necessarily just confined to one person. Sometimes it's an institution or an organization,
yeah,
which can
sure.
happen. And by the way, I also want to acknowledge this can go both ways. You can also be hurt as a leader, right? I remember a pastor saying sometimes the sheep bite, right? So what was that impact to you, and what did you lose in the process? Like what did this cost you? Sometimes it's a monetary cost, right?
Mm,
If it impacted your job, you didn't get uh, the promotion or whatever the thing was. And then sometimes it's other costs. There's emotional costs. There can be spiritual costs. There's different things in there. And I will say this, when you go into this, we have the ability, it doesn't have to just be like, oh man, I'm focusing on how awful this was. Enter into this process realizing we serve a God of justice. He
yeah,
is a God of recompense, right? He
yeah,
is a God who says when the thief is caught, he has to repay 7 times, complete repayment. And so as you kind of acknowledge those losses, do it with a sense of hope that God's going to make it right. Maybe that person participates, maybe they have nothing to do with it and God does it another way. But that
yeah,
allows you to then say, like, oh my goodness, if I am filing a claim in the court of heaven, well, I want to get my money's I'm gonna list everything that I need to deal with, and it becomes hope filled then instead of like, oh man, this long list. It's like, no, 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 this is stuff that God's gonna help me with.
yeah,
And then we move into the receiving validation, right? Which, especially kind of to your point, if that has not been acknowledged at all, then it's important to do that. And we're wanting to receive validation. Sometimes that's from another person. Sometimes that's in our relationship with the Holy Spirit, right? He is the comforter. And so to
mm,
receive validation and comfort and empathy, and somebody saying, that was not okay what happened,
mhm,
and I'm
mhm,
really sorry that you had to go through that. I'm sorry that you were hurt by that. That apology may not come from the leader. They may not be able to give you that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
God can give you that and heal your heart in that space. And I think this step, I call it like the pain management step of dealing with leadership injury. And this is one that's so often overlooked. I
mm,
think especially in the church, we want to jump to forgiveness because we don't want to have unforgiveness. And
yeah,
so it's really easy to foreclose on on what's happened and to skip this step, right? And yet, to your point about, finding compassion, I think when I've received compassion, when I've received validation and somebody cares about me and how I've been hurt, then now I'm going to be much more likely to have compassion. It's going to
yeah,
be a lot easier to forgive if my own hurts and my wounds have been tended. The
yeah,
other thing I'll say here, right? So we think about the soul being the mind, the will, and the emotions. the choice to forgive is an act of the will. This is dealing with the emotions. And so if you've had something where you've tried to forgive, or you said, I did forgive, but this keeps coming up and it keeps hurting, take a look. Did you ever receive validation, empathy, or comfort for that? And if the answer is no, then go back to that step. And whether it's with a friend, whether it's a therapist, a pastor, another healthy leader, whether it's just you and the Lord, go back and receive that comfort. And that's going to give you the breakthrough to be able to hold on to that choice that you made to forgive, right?
Mhm.
Our third step is to release negativity, right? So
Mhm.
if we wanted to put that in a Christian framework, that might include the forgiveness there, but saying like, wow, I've been holding on to what happened to me. I've been holding on to this negative narrative, been holding on to pain. I may have been holding on to judgments against that person, against myself, maybe even against God. And now is the time for me to release those things. And keep in mind, this is not saying it was okay, right?
Yeah.
If it was okay, then there would be nothing to talk about.
Yes.
This is not saying that you have to trust that person again.
Yeah.
Forgiveness is about the past and trust is about the future. So it's not saying that you have to trust them, but it's saying I'm no longer going to hold on to this idea that they owe me something. I'm no longer going to try to extract vengeance from that person,
Yeah.
retribution or repayment from that person. I'm
Yeah.
going to appeal to God to be the one to make it right. And I'm going to at least not keep reliving this bad
Yeah.
thing that happened. I don't want to
Yeah.
keep nursing and rehearsing it in my victim story over and over again. Right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
this is really an empowering step. I'm going to take my power back, right? Because if I'm a powerful person, I can make the choice to say, I'm going to let go of this. I'm going to release it. I'm going to trust God to make it right. The alternative is I'm not going to do that unless and until that person comes to me and apologizes, unless and until that person makes amends. Well, now I've put the power of my happiness in the hands of my enemy. Oh,
Yep.
that's maybe not the best place for it to be. So this
Yeah.
is a taking my power back and saying like, okay, I'm going to learn to walk in that forgiveness to be able to say, I mean, if Jesus can do it when he's being crucified, we can do it through whatever we're going through. And it's actually, he is the one who empowers us to
Mm.
take this step. We don't do it in our own human strength.
Mm.
We
Mm.
draw on his strength to be able to release that negativity and let it go. And
Mm.
then that puts us in a position to re-examine those powerful decisions, right? Oh, okay. Well, when I was 9 years old, I made a decision never to speak up in front of authority. How is that serving me now?
Mm.
Oh, it's not. Oh, that's holding me back.
Mm.
Even if it's a, hey, you know what? I will only do that under certain circumstances.
Mm. Mm.
Okay, I'm going to learn to read the room. I'm going to, whatever. I'm going to level up. But to go back, were there any decisions that I said never, should, must, always? Any of those kind of things are key markers. And I
Never,
think
should, must, always. I like
yes,
that.
yes. You'll also
Yep.
know, I'll give you some suggestions here. Do a little fill in the blank exercise with respect to leadership. I am fill in the blank. Leaders are, or
Mhm.
leaders always, leaders should,
Mhm.
leaders never, right? You can use the same thing, bosses, right? Bosses
Yeah.
do this or bosses don't do that, or authority is. And when you do these little fill in the blanks, it will highlight what are those powerful decisions that you've made, right? So if we've
Mm.
got the mind, the will, and the emotions, the validation is the emotions, the releasing negativity is an act of the will. And now we're renewing the mind with truth that sets us free, right? So then that brings us to our final step, which is to redeem your story.
Mm.
Right. And this is the part where we get to say, okay, so I had this bad boss, but I'm going to use that as a way to help me become the best boss I can be. Right.
Mm.
This is the Romans 8:28, where it's all working together for my good. What the enemy meant for harm,
Yes.
God is going to turn for good. So this wasn't
Yes.
happening to me, it's happening for me.
Yes.
And I'll give you an example. The gentleman I mentioned earlier, right, who had gotten just, ripped by his CEO. We were able to work together. And when we went through, these steps, kind of breaking off some things, he figured out, oh, wow, I had made a powerful decision about who I was and
Mhm.
judged myself based on this one interaction. I'm like, well, maybe that's not a fair representation. One conversation, one person's opinion on one day of my life doesn't sum up all of who I am as a man,
Yeah.
right? Or as a
Yeah.
leader.
Yeah.
And so he did that work and things shifted and he actually became the CEO of another organization. Right. And so saying, like, oh, wow, I can actually overcome. And now I can become the kind of leader who heals and protects others. And
Yeah.
so if you've been hurt, I want you to think about, like, you may have had a narrative of like how you tell that story up to this point.
Yeah.
I want you to fast forward and say, what story do I want to tell? And maybe it's a while before I get there. Maybe I still got to go through these steps. But
Yeah.
what story do I want to tell someday about
Yeah.
what, how this came out, how it was used for my good?
Yeah.
What is the but God, right? What's going to give him glory and others hope? But before we kind of get to that, I do want to speak to this part of being the villain
Mm. Mm.
or the guide, right? Because that's
Mhm.
everything we've talked about up to this point is really about, you know, how you've lived under another leader, most
Yes.
likely, right?
Yes.
But then I'm assuming everyone on this call is in some sort of leadership capacity.
Mm.
And so when that's the case, you may be the villain or you may be the guide. And so from the villain's perspective, I think, first of all, recognizing, hey, there may be some of those things that you're like, yeah, that was not my finest leadership moment. And I can own that. And
Yeah.
and maybe I owe somebody an apology.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do that. And I recognize that when I own that, I'm actually going to increase respect. And that's part of the healing, right?
Yes.
They might not
Yes.
have been fortunate enough to get this call and these 5 steps to go through
Yes.
without your
Yes.
apology.
Yes.
So you can take ownership of that. There can also be things that are unknown. Have I hurt somebody without knowing? Well, ask God
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
ask your people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, you're going to gain respect if you say, hey, by the way,
Yeah.
has there been anything in my leadership
Yeah.
that has been harmful to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just putting the question on the table will be a
Yeah.
healing thing that opens up conversation and opportunity for feedback.
Which is one of the hardest things to do, because if you haven't done that and you've led the same people for 10 years, they're all going to look at you and be like, why is he asking? Why is she asking? It's very hard to show up as a new leader in front of your old team.
Mhm.
And so what I often encourage people, just tell them that you've decided, in this phase of your career, you want to work on your leadership skills and be a great, to be the best leader and steward. I prefer the phrase stewardship to leadership, of people. And then maybe it just allows them a little more like, okay, she's not up to something or he's not up to something, and maybe they'll feel like, okay, but then you also need to be very clear that when you receive that feedback, that you are ready to control your facial expressions, to not argue it, to not try to counter it, oh, but, and make excuses. Because if you meet that first feedback with that kind of response, they'll never trust you again for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where, even if it's a perceived injury, because I feel like but before we kind of get to that, I do want to speak to this part of being the villain
Mm. Mm.
or the guide, right? Because that's
Mm.
everything we've talked about up to this point is really about, you know, how you've lived under another leader, most
Yes.
likely, right?
Yes.
But then I'm assuming everyone on this call is in some sort of leadership capacity.
Mm.
And so when that's the case, you may be the villain or you may be the guide. And so from the villain's perspective, I think, first of all, recognizing, hey, there may be some of those things that you're like, yeah, that was not my finest leadership moment. And I can own that. And
Yeah.
and maybe I owe somebody an apology.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do that. And I recognize that when I own that, I'm actually going to increase respect. And that's part of the healing, right?
Yes.
They might not
Yes.
have been fortunate enough to get this call and these 5 steps to go through
Yeah.
without your
Yeah.
apology.
Yeah.
So you can take ownership of that. There can also be things that are unknown. Have I hurt somebody without knowing? Well, ask God
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
ask your people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, you're going to gain respect if you say, hey, by the way,
Yeah.
has there been anything in my leadership
Yeah.
that has been harmful to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just putting the question on the table will be a
Yeah.
healing thing that opens up conversation and opportunity for feedback, even if it's a perceived injury. Because I feel like it's also important to acknowledge you can do everything right.
Yes.
God did everything right. And yet we get
Yes.
our feelings hurt because he doesn't do things the way we think he should,
Yes.
when or how. Right.
Yes.
And then, by the way, Jesus, I mean, let's talk about so perfect leader, right? He says
Yes.
to one of his followers, get behind me, Satan. How would you
Yes.
like it if your boss called you Satan? Like, that might go in the leadership injury category for some of us, right? Now, was Jesus, intentionally wounding someone? No, right? But and he really was, I think, talking to Satan at that point. But Peter might not have felt that way when it happened, And so recognizing you might not have done anything in error, that doesn't mean that no one was hurt. And
Yeah.
when that happens, I think you're exactly right in terms of like your number one thing. Go to that step number two of providing the validation, the comfort, and the empathy, and saying, like, I'm really sorry. I can see how tough that must have been for you. Right.
Yeah.
There's a temptation to explain. And sometimes it's appropriate to say, hey, this is why I did that. But that is not your first thing, because you don't want to be apologizing and then undoing your apology with an explanation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not trying to justify or defend yourself or anything like that. And you have to have wisdom and guidance from the Holy Spirit to know, would sharing a little bit more context help them feel,
Yes.
oh, I get it?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
is that going to feel actually invalidating to them that you're just trying to defend yourself and make
Yeah.
excuses, right? Your number one thing, I love your word stewardship is one that I use as well. It is
Yeah.
the stewardship of hearts. How do I
Yeah.
tend the
Yeah.
heart of the person in front of me, whether I was in the wrong, whether
Yeah.
I knew I was in the wrong, whether I wasn't in the wrong, whether I think I'm in the right, but it's
It's
not
not by
visible.
act. It's not by accident that we are put in the organizations and the teams that we are in. We have been called to be stewards of each other's journeys. Yeah.
And that's so much of what we have the opportunity to do as
Yeah.
leaders, is to represent his heart. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the reasons that the enemy works so hard. Leadership injuries are a different, like, we have peer-to-peer interactions and we get
Yeah.
hurt in relationship. But when it comes from an authority figure, there's an extra weight. And by the way, if it's an authority figure in a faith-based community, right? Even additional weight of this person is actually representing God in
Yeah.
a sense,
Yeah.
good or bad, right?
Yeah.
And so just like we can be hurt and our God image can be distorted, where we start projecting the things that we've experienced from bad, parents, teachers,
Yeah.
coaches, bosses, whatever,
Yeah.
onto him, we can also see when a leader shows up representing his heart, it actually connects us with the heart of God. And we have the opportunity to connect with the heart of the Father and release that to others. And that's the part where we get to become the guide, right? When you're the leader, you're no longer the hero. You are actually bringing out the hero in someone else.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you have the opportunity to be the guide and to say, what does this person need? How can I steward this heart to help
Yep.
them reach their God-given destiny, become all that they're created to be?
Yeah.
And if I take that frame, then now I have the ability to lead in a way that potentially heals past
Yeah.
leadership injuries. I know I've had that happen, right? I remember a pastor who volunteered his time to serve me. And I was like, I had been in churches where it was all about, like, hey, you better serve. And it's all about you giving to them and serving and give, 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 give. And so for a pastor unsolicited to come to me and say, I have this set of gifts. I would love to spend some time with you and invest in what you're doing. What?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. And that
Well,
was
and it also takes a great deal of weight off the leader to not have to be the hero,
mm-hmm,
but to turn and that guide. I relate that sort of back to my coaching comment.
mm-hmm,
What if
mm-hmm,
our sole responsibility is in leadership is to help develop the leadership of others?
right.
And in doing that, we are achieving organizational outcomes. We are achieving team goals because we're releasing the good leadership that God has put into everybody. It takes all different forms and fashions for sure. Um, but to not be the one who's making all the decisions, who's telling, who's commanding. I mean, that style is such an old paradigm. I can't believe we haven't killed it yet, given that the top-down leadership model has been outdated for at least 30 years,
Right.
but still alive and well.
It is. It is. I say there's an unholy trinity of lies, fear, and control. Right. And that's what happens when we don't believe the truth and we feel like, oh my goodness, if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. So now
Yeah,
I'm afraid if I empower somebody else that it's going to be done wrong and that's going to reflect poorly on me. Right. So now all of my fears of failure from the people
yeah,
at the top of
yeah.
my organization are coming. And then what do? I clamp down and control. Right.
Mm.
And yet that gets undone when I believe the truth that, oh, actually, there are other people, we're one body, and there are people who are more gifted to do this than I am. Okay. Now I'm not operating in fear, I'm operating in love. And instead of control, there's freedom. And so there's kind of a reversal of that paradigm. And if I can go about believing in other people and
Yeah.
bringing out the best in them, then now we're in a place where we're empowering and equipping.
Just wanted to pivot here. I want you to share with folks the Leadership Injury Project, because I think that might be very appealing to this group of folks to be able to
Yes.
participate
Yes. I
and
would
have some free consultation as
Yes,
part.
yes, yes. So I will do that. Let me come back to this. And the Leadership Injury Project is basically a research project, but it includes an interview that gives you an opportunity to get a free consultation. And basically, what we'll do, there's a brief questionnaire you do online, and then from there, we'll set up a Zoom session. And we schedule those to be, at most 90 minutes. Really, most people are probably done in 60. And during that time, you get a chance to tell your story. And it's the
Yeah.
good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So it's the tough things that have happened and the challenges that you've been through. But we're also going to talk about great leadership, and that's kind of where I would like to end today, when we're done here. But also you have a chance to say, like, hey, these are the issues that I'm finding. Either, hey, this is where I'm at in the healing process, or hey, maybe this is next. By the way, if you're like, okay, so I think I'm good, but I'm seeing this on my team, and I know I've got somebody who's being held back, and like, how do I navigate that as a leader to approach that in a way that's healing for them? We could talk about that. And just by having that conversation, sharing your experience, then you're contributing to our understanding of leadership injury so that we can better help others. And my desire is that these are going to be healing conversations that are going to help move people through the process and equip people to address and prevent leadership injuries in the future. So if you're interested in that, maybe it's for you. Maybe you're thinking about someone in your organization, or you'd like to bring this message to your organization. DrAprilSpeaks.com. That way you don't have to know how to spell Minatrea. DrAprilSpeaks.com. And there's a little form at the bottom. You can fill that out and send me an email, and I'd be happy to talk with you, whether it's about the leadership injury, project and getting you or somebody in your organization into that, or, something else that I can do to serve you. That's the best way to get a hold of me.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. I'll see some of you at Accord. I'll be hosting a lunch table about the Alliance and the Beyond Talk campaign. But we want to give April a huge shout out for an amazing session today. Thank you so much. So grateful for this conversation. It's given the amount of chat and conversation. It was obviously a much needed topic, and we may decide to come back and circle back to this in 2025. Just staggering that we're already starting to talk about our 20 to 25 topics. So everybody, thank you so much for showing up. Let me pray over you, because this is a topic that can bring some stuff. Heavenly Father, you are the model of leadership that we all aspire to and wish to experience in this world. And so for all of the pains, all of the hurts, all of the triumphs, all of the beautiful people that we've been entrusted to steward, Lord, we thank you for all of it. We ask your healing touch where it's needed, and we ask your encouragement to keep going and keep being good leaders where that's needed too. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, good people. It's good to see you all. We'll see you next month. We have a special topic. We're doing a joint welcoming table talk with the Accord Network and with the Wheaton Network, Wheaton Consortium. So it's going to be a fun time.